Well, here we are again. I'm Sean Fox, this is Made to Ramble, and in this episode we'll be taking a look at this, the Sony A7 IV. Now, in recent years I've been opting to do a long-term rental with just one of my cameras so that, if the opportunity should arise, something exciting comes along, I can update. When the Sony A7 IV was announced, I was pretty quick to jump on it. I've seen a lot of camera reviews comparing the A7 IV to the A7 III, which is understandable, I guess. This is the fourth iteration of that series, but I think there's actually a more interesting comparison to be made here with this, the little Sony A7c. Now, the Sony A3 may share a similar aesthetic and body shape and I guess similar handling, but in a lot of ways the A7c has quite a bit more in common. It's a newer, more effective autofocus system, no record limit for video, interval functions for time-lapse, flippy screen. In terms of performance, I doubt there's really that much difference between these two. I mean, there's a $700 US price difference between the two. You're probably getting 90% of the performance here. Is that price difference really worth the money? Let's find out, shall we? So, first of all, let's take a quick look at these two cameras side by side. Obviously, the dimensions are a little different. Weight too. Although it's not as big a difference as you might imagine. The weight with battery and card for the A7c is 509 grams, or 1.1 pound if you happen to live in one of those backward-ass countries that still hasn't adopted the metric system. Get with the times. The A7 IV, though, is 658 grams, or 1.4 pound. 1.1 versus 1.4, not a huge difference. The A7c does have a smaller grip, which is nowhere near as comfortable as that of the A7 IV, but don't be deceived by the diminutive appearance. The A7c feels like a quality product. This is no plastic toy. It's weather sealed, just like the A7 IV, and frankly, in my opinion, it's a nicer looking camera. So obviously there's a big difference in camera controls. The A7c has very little in the way of custom buttons and controls, just one dial at the back and a control ring, of course. This makes it a lot harder to customize to your liking. The A7 IV, though, has all the custom buttons, dials and joysticks you could possibly want. It's far superior where ergonomics are concerned. I especially love how they've replaced the exposure compensation dial with this sort of blank locking dial. By default, it does still control exposure compensation, but you can use it to control ISO or whatever else you like. And that lock, that is a godsend, especially for exposure compensation. No more accidentally changing exposure when you didn't want to. That used to drive me freaking crazy on the A7c. Both cameras can charge via USB-C. In fact, neither camera gets a charger, so you have to charge via USB-C. The A7 IV also has a micro USB port, which can be used to connect a wired remote, that sort of thing. The A7c does not have that. Both cameras have a mic jack and a headphone jack. Both cameras use the same NP-FZ100 type battery. Much, much better than the battery in my old A7R II. Those older Sony batteries really sucked. These are good. While the A7c has just a single UHS 2 SD card slot, the A7 II has two. And one of these also doubles as a CF Express Type A card slot. Which brings me to another point of comparison here. Both cameras are advertised as having the same 10 frames per second maximum burst rate, but the A7 IV can apparently manage up to 828 shots without buffering. Faster speeds are accomplished when using compressed RAW or JPEG. Speed's apparently quite a bit slower with lossless or uncompressed RAW. Now I've got this set for compressed RAW. Here is the A7 IV with continuous shooting set to high. Take a listen. That was starting to buffer then, and it did not sound like that was, no, it was about 140 shots. Let's compare that now with the A7c. I suspect that the 828 shots is actually when using a CF Express card and not an SD card, even a V90 card like I'm using here. All right, again, continuous shooting high plus for the A7c. And that started buffering a bit. And I gotta wait for it to finish. 137 shots, so pretty similar performance. I guess the takeaway here is if you're not planning to spend the I don't know, what is it, $400 US on a decent capacity CF Express card, you get similar performance from both. Now this may be different when you start to factor in the actual autofocus speed. That may change the burst rate, but we'll find that out a little bit later on in this video. So yeah, as far as photography goes, those are really the main differences that I can see. We'll just have to check out that autofocus later on. So on to video now. Both the A7 III and the 4 are true hybrid cameras. They perform extremely well with both photography and video. The A7 IV has gotten some major upgrades where video is concerned though. In NTSC mode you can have 24, 30 and 60 frames per second 4K available, while in PAL it's 25 and 50. These can all be filmed at 10-bit 422. Now there is a 1.4 times crop on the 50 and 60 frames per second, which I know a lot of people were kind of disappointed about. But there's no pixel binning, so the quality is still outstanding. Just means the image is a little bit cropped. At 1080p, you can still film up to 120 frames per second, but as best as I can tell, this is just at 8-bit 420, much the same as the A7c. The A7c cannot do 4K at 50 or 60, and it's only capable of 8-bit 420 in all the video modes. So does that make much of a difference? Yes and no. If you're planning to do much color grading, the 10-bit 422 could be really handy. But I suspect for a lot of people, myself included, it's not really all that necessary. You aren't going to notice any difference in quality just eyeballing the footage. It's only when you really push the colors that the extra color information starts to make much of a difference. Most of us probably are just filming for YouTube, in which case don't really need to do a whole lot of color work. Is the A7 IV worth getting just for 4K 60? Maybe. The truth is, I don't really need 4K 60 422 10-bit. No one watching is going to see the difference, but kind of want it anyway. Can't help buying into the hype, I guess. In reality, my eyes are starting to fail me a little, so I'm not even 100% sure I can tell the difference between 4K and 1080p anymore. But I still want it. One really peculiar thing of note with the A7 IV is that you can record video in HEVC, or high efficiency video codec, otherwise known as H.265. Now this is a video codec that produces much smaller file sizes while maintaining the same, or in some cases, maybe even better video quality. Can be a little bit harder to edit as you need a bit more processing power, but it's handy having such small files. The weird thing is that this option isn't available for 25 or 30p. 24 frames per second in 4K is available, as is 50 frames per second in 60, but for some reason 25 and 30 are just not options. What the hell's going on there, Sony? Both cameras have Ibis, or in-body image stabilization. I believe the Ibis in the A7 IV performs maybe a little bit better, probably because there's a bit more room for the sensor to move inside the camera, but neither performs anywhere near as well as Panasonic or Olympus cameras. Both the A7 IV and the A7c record gyro data, so footage can be stabilized later using Sony's Catalyst Browse software, which looks fantastic, as long as you keep the shutter speed just a little bit faster than normal. Where the two cameras differ though is that the A7 IV has active or electronic stabilization, which does seem to make quite a bit of a difference. I probably wouldn't be using it for walking. I mean, Catalyst Browse would be a better option there, but for sort of still handheld shots and maybe like panning and stuff, I think that stabilization works pretty well. Now, as for overheating, I've not been able to get either camera to overheat at all. Not with the overheat shutdown thingy set to high. So I wouldn't hesitate to use either camera for event videography. Might rethink this if I were filming a concert outdoors in summer in Abu Dhabi, I guess, but for most use cases, overheating shouldn't prove to be an issue. So anyway, let's take a break from all these specs and having a look at my face for a while, and we'll take a look at some of the footage that I was able to take on the first day with the A7 IV. There's some pretty good examples of how it handles in high dynamic range situations, and there's also a lot of low light footage, where I was in the city filming at night. They're Christmas lights. So I am putting in chapters, so you can skip this if it starts to get boring. But after this, I'm going to take both of the cameras to the Perth Zoo, and we'll try and do a proper comparison of autofocus. We'll also take a look at how much of a difference the resolution makes between the two cameras, and also how the autofocus maybe affects the burst rate as well. So you'll want to stick around for that. Perth Zoo, and for today, just for today, I have rented out the Sony 100-400 G Master lens. This is a lens I have always wanted to try. So I figured a telephoto lens was probably the best way to test out the autofocus on these cameras, and the only real telephoto lens I have at home is an 85mm Viltrox. Not quite long enough, but this should definitely do the job. When Sony first announced the A7 IV, one of the biggest selling features for it was the fact that it had the bird eye autofocus tracking, just like the A1. There aren't too many cameras that have that. Funny enough though, last week Sony released a firmware upgrade for the A7C, which also added it to that. So that's pretty cool. The one thing I would really like to try with this is the 1.4 times and 2 times teleconverters. I suspect that might be where you really start to see a difference in performance between this and the A7C, because as I understand it, a lot of other cameras have some quite severe limitations on the autofocus as you start to get down to narrower apertures. And of course, when you attach a teleconverter, you're automatically dropping down to a narrower aperture. Stabilization isn't perfect, you still get a little bit of jerking from time to time, but it's still really impressive for a 400mm focal length. Alright, might swap over cameras here. Try using the A7C for a while, see if it's much different. The one thing that I have noticed with both the animal and the bird eye autofocus is that you do have to get reasonably close to your subject. I suppose the same is true of humans though, but it's quite a lot easier to get humans close. You just ask them. God, looks so little. Doesn't feel as unbalanced as I thought it might. Ooh, it does now. One thing which becomes immediately apparent as soon as you start using these two cameras side by side, the viewfinder on this thing is really very poor quality. It's nice to have a viewfinder, but the viewfinder on the A7 IV is miles ahead of this. Much more pleasant to use. Funny enough, playing with the settings here on the A7 IV, I'm not seeing that bird eye autofocus setting, despite the fact that I did actually update the firmware a few days ago, so unless I'm missing something, it's just not here. Well, I'm not sure what to make of all of that. I will say that I felt there was a noticeable improvement in the effectiveness of the eye tracking autofocus on the A7 IV. It seemed a lot quicker to latch on, and it stayed with the eyes a lot more consistently. The animal eye autofocus on the A7C is definitely not the same thing, although it does work in some cases, but the animal needs to be larger in the frame, and it also depends on the type of animal. It seems that I was mistaken about the new firmware in the A7C. It did add some new animal eye autofocus features, but there doesn't appear to be anything specific for birds. What they apparently did do was add animal eye autofocus in video, which is actually a pretty big deal. And from what I've seen from the footage, it seems to work really well. So, although the autofocus seemed to be quite a bit better on the A7 IV, I have to admit there wasn't a huge difference in the number of keepers I ended up with. My biggest takeaway from all of this is that before renting a $3,500 lens for the day, I might pay to be a little more familiar with the cameras I'm using. The A7 IV is of course brand new to me, but I'm not even super familiar with the A7C, even though I've had it for 6 months. I've used it on a couple of projects that I've been working on, but more often than not, when I'm reaching for a camera, it's the GH5 I grab. Not because it's a better camera, but because it's the camera that I know really well. The GH5 does have a more intuitive menu system, I think, than either of the Sony cameras, but it mostly just comes down to the layout of the buttons and dials. I can make changes on the fly really quickly without even looking, and in some cases, I think that's more important than the sensor size or even image quality. I guess that also speaks to why the A7 IV might be the better purchase. That customization is really important, I think. As far as the quality difference with the increased res goes, I was kind of hoping to get more photos of the same subject side by side to compare, but it didn't really turn out that way. The really sharp photos that I did manage to get from both cameras look excellent. At 100% zoom, I'd say there's not a huge difference, but without having an identical subject in identical lighting conditions, it's not that easy to tell, which is probably all you need to know. It's not that easy to tell. Either of these cameras is a great option, and you'll get excellent results from both, as long as you put in the time needed to getting to know the camera really well. What we do with the camera is a whole lot more important than the camera specs themselves. Where these two cameras are concerned, I don't think resolution or image quality are an important distinction. What really matters is the form factor. Do you prefer the compact size of the A7C, sacrificing customization somewhat, or are all those buttons and dials more important to you? I will say that if your primary focus is on sports and wildlife, then it's a no-brainer really. I do think you'll get better performance in the long run from the A7 IV. For any other photography though, I don't think it matters which way you go, as long as you take the time to learn the camera well. Both cameras are beasts really. Anyhow, that'll do for this video, I think. I hope you have gotten something out of it, especially having watched it this far. I think this might be the longest video I've made yet. If you enjoyed the video, lightly tap that like button. I've only just reached 400 subscribers yesterday, so I would really appreciate it if you'd subscribe. Still a little bit away from that 15 trillion subscribers I'd like to have. Thanks for watching, bye for now, and I'll see you next time.